let's continue with the Jose Curbelo story. Now, it's his son, Rene Curbelo's turn.
Looks like your dad. Hi, Rene. Rene, tell me about your granddad.
You know, I know that he was an American citizen and a Cuban citizen.
Oh, in the 1800s?
In the 1800s. I'm not sure how that happened, but I know that my great-grandfather was an American citizen and a Cuban citizen, and he fought with Teddy Roosevelt with the Rough Riders to free Cuba from Spain.
Yes.
So I guess that's how my grandfather ended up having dual citizenship. So when my father was born, he was an American citizen.
In Havana?
In Havana.
He had dual?
He had dual. So when he came to the United States with, I think, $30 or $40 in his pocket, not speaking English, he came as an American citizen.
And he already played. He was already a musician.
Oh, he was already a known musician in Cuba. He played with the Riverside Orchestra that toured South
Orchestra
America.
Riverside. We were most famous.
Right.
He was already playing with them.
He was already playing with them, but he wanted to come to New York because that was the center of music at the time.
That's your dad?
That's my father. My grandfather and my grandmother stayed in Cuba, and after my father established himself, he brought them to the United States. Now, my grandfather was, and almost all of the men in my father's side of the family were musicians. My grandfather played with the Havana Symphony Orchestra, first violin. So, and he was a really good violin player. And I remember when I was growing up, we would play duos. Classical piece, I would play the piano and he would play on the violin.
You were born in Havana also?
No, I was born in New York City.
Oh, so he came here and he met your mom here.
He came here in 39 and he was already pretty well established by 41.
As a musician with an orchestra?
Right. He got a job right away as a piano player. And after, learning the ropes and knowing about New York, he decided I want to have my own band. And he formed a band, and Tito Puente was in his band.
Well, I think that Tito Puente got his first break with your father.
Yes.
I understand. The picture that we have and we're seeing now is Tito and Maestro Jose Curbelo, the director in Key West, you said it was?
They got a job together, playing together, and they became very fast friends. They were playing on Miami Beach, and after the job, who knows what time it was over, they said, we've never been to Key West. I'd like to go to Key West. They got in my father's used car, that was his first car, and they drove to Key West. Who knows how long that would have taken them because, back then the roads weren't like they are now. So they went to Key West, took that picture. I guess they hung out for a little while, turned around and went back home, back to Miami because they had to work that night.
But Tito Puente got his break then with him.
Yes, because my father was so impressed with Tito that he kept on promoting him, and eventually he started his own band with my father's blessings.
And then eventually he was his manager.
Yes. After, when my father then retired from his band, and my grandfather, who was the bass player in my father's band, did you know that?
No.
Well, that picture right there in the middle, that picture is my grandfather on the bass, my father in the white suit, and in the back, there are 3 horn players, and the middle horn player was my cousin Nilo.
The whole family was...
Well, there were so many musicians that my father, brought in who he thought were the best musicians and put them in his band.
Tell me about your dad as you remember him as a child.
Well, he was always a very family-oriented father. And when we lived, my first recollection was when we lived on 49th Street and 8th Avenue, right next to the original Madison Square Garden.
Oh.
And I would remember every year he would take me to the circus, my mother, my sister, and I.
He would take you. He was a good dad.
Yeah, he would take us to the circus. And one of the, aside from loving to go to the circus, when the elephants came, they were dropped off at Grand Central Station and they paraded up 8th Avenue, right across the front of our apartment building into Madison Square Garden for the circus. So that was like an event for me to see the elephants that close.
Of course.
So that was a lot of fun. And then when I started the 3rd grade, my sister was in the 5th grade, my parents decided that they wanted to give us a good education, and where we were living, the schools weren't so good. So we moved to Riverdale, which is in the West Bronx, and it was a very suburban kind of part of New York. It was not developed. There was just a few apartment buildings there, a lot of areas for kids to play. The schools were better. And my sister and I went to school there right up until probably the end of my first year in high school, because I was lucky enough to go to the High School of Music and Art, which was in Manhattan. So instead of my father having to commute, he decided, well, why am I commuting? Let's move back to Manhattan. So we moved back to Manhattan, which I loved.
Where to?
We moved to an apartment building called the Schwab House. It was on 74th and West End, Riverside Drive.
Excellent.
Riverside Drive. Nice.
Nice neighborhood.
Nice neighborhood. And he would commute to work. And his office was on, I think, 52nd and Broadway. So we lived on 74th. It was 20 blocks. He could have walked, but most of the time he took a cab or a bus, or he had the person that worked with him, his protege, so to speak. I did not want to go into business with my father.
Why not?
Well, we both had very strong personalities. And I knew that eventually that was going to cause friction between us. And I loved my father, and I wanted to have a father-son relationship, not a contentious business relationship. Because I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood, an American neighborhood. I became very Americanized. So my music, I loved Latin music when I was growing up, and my father would take me to all the clubs. Starting when I was around 13, 14 years old, I would go with him, and I loved the music.
Did you play piano like your dad?
From the age of 7, I took piano lessons. Classical, reading music, and then when I went to High School of Music and Art, I learned arranging, conducting. I learned how to play the bass fiddle, which was my grandfather's instrument. So I enjoyed having both instruments available to me.
Rene, I'm impressed with his Jose Curbelo management. Tell me about that.
Well, when my father realized, you have to remember in the 50s was the coming of TV. TV started coming into the homes. Prior to that, when people wanted to be entertained, they had to go to a nightclub. That was the standard way of people getting entertainment. And most restaurants, nightclubs, they had 1, 2, sometimes 3 bands. When TV came in, that really hurt the music business. Plus, my father was in his late 30s, maybe early 40, and he said, nobody wants to see a 40-year-old man on stage. They want to see the 20-year-old men on stage. So he saw the writing on the wall between the TV and what was happening in the music business, and he said, I have to get out of this, but I can do it in the management part of it I guess he realized that he was paying commission to a manager that was booking him in nightclubs, and he thought, hey, that sounds like a better way of making a living. My father did have a manager, and he approached that agency. I forget what the name of the agency was, but if I remember, I'll let you know. And they said, okay, you know, you want to become a manager, come, and you know, we'll throw you some work. And this agency did American music and Latin music.
Okay.
He said to himself, well, there should be an agency that just does Latin music. And that was his opportunity. He saw that niche to get into the business and be successful, and that's what he did.
For how long?
Well, that probably started in the mid-50s, 55, when he was working for the agency, maybe 56. He decided to go on his own, or 57, somewhere around there. And yeah, he did that, and his first band, and again, because he was a musician, he knew all the other musicians in the Latin field. The first one he approached was his friend, Tito Puente.
Of course.
And he brought Tito Puente in, and once Tito Puente, who was the biggest name at that point, and Machito, he brought them because they were friends, and they trusted him, and they knew that my father at that point was a good businessman.
And also Tito Rodriguez.
And Tito Rodriguez. And there was always a little competition between
the Titos.
The Titos, right.
But he had Charanga 76, he had
All
the genres.
That came later, and once he had the core of the biggest names, all of the other bands wanted to join. And it ended up, he literally had a monopoly on the Latin music in New York, which translated to Latin music anywhere, because New York was the center. Well, my father, when I was maybe 13, 14, bought a house in the Catskills, and the year before that, we stayed at a bungalow colony just to check it out to see if we were going to like it, and he loved it. We all loved it. So he bought the house, and it was a beautiful house right on the lake. And we spent summers there, and many weekends during the winter even, we would spend there. And when I formed my first band, in the University of Miami, he booked my band at the Laurels Country Club. I think it was the summer of 65. Yeah, I think it was the summer of 65 or 66, around there. And that was like so much fun because, you know, I'm 19 years old, full of energy, and all the guys in my band were like, we were so close friends, and all of the women wanted to be with the musicians. So how can you not
enjoy it?
How can you not enjoy it?
Did you play Latin or did you play jazz? What did you play?
We played rock and roll.
Oh,
because that's what
was in.
That's the main music at the time, was rock and roll, and my father bought me an organ, and that's what I was playing because that was the instrument for rock and roll. And great musicians. One of the musicians in my band eventually won a Grammy. Another one became a very prominent music teacher in South Florida. The other one became an eye doctor, and I went on my career path.
What was your career? Your next career?
My next career after I graduated at the University of Miami was I was a school teacher in the South Bronx, teaching kids that had just recently come to the United States and needed the transition from Spanish to English. And that was my job. And it helped me get back a little bit of my Spanish.
What year was that?
That was from 69 to 71.
What school?
I know it was on Jennings Street. That job was a result of Machito.
Why?
Because when I graduated the University of Miami and came back home to New York, it was the height of Vietnam, 1969. And I was going to be drafted. And my father knew that Machito had political connections.
Oh.
And Machito got me an interview in this program. They were looking for recent college graduates that were bilingual. And even though my Spanish was very bad, I kind of faked my way and bluffed my way through, and that saved my life because I would have ended up in Vietnam.
God bless Machito.
God bless Machito. And I'm still communicating with his son, Mario.
Mario, who's a wonderful person.
He seems like a wonderful. I never met him because with this COVID thing, the next time I travel to New York, I want to meet him.
When did your father pass?
My father passed away in 2012 at 95 years old. And actually, until he was probably 93, he was in pretty good health and he was living his life. And then his health started to fail, and he moved into the neighborhood that I was living in, which was in the California Club off of Ivesbury Road, so that my mother and my father could be near me in case they needed help. And I was grateful for that because before that they lived in Kendall, which was a 45-minute drive. And whenever anything happened, I would have to run down to Kendall to help them in any way I needed to help.
Did he still play piano a little bit?
He probably played until he was around maybe 90. He enjoyed playing the piano, but you know, arthritis gets in your fingers, and you know, he had trouble sitting for too long on the piano bench. So after a while, he just stopped playing. But he had a little studio in his home, similar to what I have, and he would sit there and listen to music. And he would love to listen to new music, new Latin music, and old music. He had a tremendous collection of CDs of Latin and jazz.
Oh.
Those were his genres that he loved. And when I was growing up and playing the piano, he encouraged me to learn jazz because aside from classical, because that's the foundation, but then I started learning jazz because that's also the foundation of modern. So he lived a very fulfilled life, I think.
Was he peaceful when he left?
He was peaceful. He died in the hospital, in hospice, from pneumonia and heart failure.
Your mom, she lived on?
My mom died in 2001, and we buried her on 9/11. Difficult for all of us. And my sister and her family came down for the funeral, and they couldn't get home because all the airports were shut.
What did you do with all the material your dad had? All the clippings and the recordings and everything?
After he passed away, I had stacks of all of that kind of stuff and his musical charts. And I thought, what am I going to do with this? And somehow I don't remember how this went about, but I got connected to the University of Miami, and they were very interested in having that in their archives for historical purposes. And I went down, and I'm a graduate of the University of Miami, so I went down there and I donated all of that material to him.
Tell me about you. As far as your career.
Well, because all the men in my family were musicians, I was trained to become a professional musician. And I was fortunate to get into the High School of Music and Art, which there I basically learned college level classes about music. And I learned another instrument, the bass fiddle. Well, I always was involved and loved music. And I gravitated very early on to recording. And my father got me an internship at RCA Studios in New York. And I worked there for while I was a school teacher. So it was a little bit difficult because, you know, I taught all day and then went to the studio at night, and it was taxing. So I maybe I did that for 6 months, but that 6 months gave me the inspiration and the motivation to learn more on my own. I bought myself a tape recorder. Eventually I bought myself a 4-track tape recorder, and I would have my musician friends come over to my house. This is when I'm living in Miami. And we would record just for fun. I even wrote a song or two, and they would write songs and we would record to see if anything happened, which nothing ever happened with it. But I was always fascinated. And back then, everything was recorded on tape. And then in the 90s, it started to transition to digital recording. Now, by the time it was the 90s, I was already in a whole different, I bypassed from music to teaching. When I came to Florida, I became a general contractor and was involved in developing several projects, construction, residential projects, even commercial projects. And then I transitioned again into opening up a video retail store.
Cool.
The rental store where you would go in and rent a movie.
Where is this?
This was in the Aventura area.
Oh.
And I opened that store in 1985, still interested in recording and music, but business was the priority. And I had that store for 11 years until eventually the big stores, Hollywood Video, Blockbuster Video, the competition was too hard. So I just liquidated the store, but knowing that that was coming, I transitioned into a completely different business of computer programming. And I became very successful with that. And that's the business that I still have, even though I'm basically retired. I still keep that business running, and I have maybe 10 or I'd say more 20, 25 clients I still maintain. But when at the height of my business career, I had 150 clients.
Rene, you have evolved with the times.
The technology moves, and if you don't keep up with the technology, whatever business or field you may be in, you're left behind. And because of my passion for music and my skills and experience in computer programming, I was able to combine the two.
What's your next project?
Well, the original concept was to gather some maybe a dozen marketable commercial songs and try to promote them. It's not so easy. I mean, there's so much competition. I read that Spotify gets 20,000 songs uploaded every day. Now, I'm sure most of those are garbage, but out of the 20,000, there has to be a few hundred that are great. So that's the competition, and that's on a daily basis. So to get your music heard is very difficult. I'm not doing it for commercial gain. I'm doing it out of love. And if anything should ever come from it, that would be a bonus. But if it never comes to anything, I enjoy the process and I enjoy the end result.
Tell me about your wife.
I met her when I was in the construction business, and I was the project manager on a residential project. And she was the salesperson that was working in the sales office. And, you know, we went out to lunch a couple of times, and then we went out to dinner, and then it became a relationship. And she was living in North Miami, I was living in Kendall. Eventually I sold my house and moved in with her in an apartment in North Miami. And we were together 39 years. And she contracted lung cancer because when I met her, she was a smoker. I've never smoked. And we fought the disease for 2.5 years together. And she passed away in 2017. It's a wonderful marriage. I was very fortunate to have that love in my life. And I'm very fortunate to be in love again with a new woman that I think is wonderful. And life goes on. And when my wife passed away, I wasn't going to just curl up and...
She wouldn't want that.
No, I don't think she would have wanted that. I wouldn't have wanted it for her either. So I was very determined to bring love into my life again because I feel that's very important.
Well, you have a lot of love. You have many loves. You love music and you love the world.
Yes.
Because you're making it happier with your talent. Thank you, Rene. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maestro Jose Curbelo.